World War II ended on September 2nd, 1945. The Nazi Party had carried out a lot of crimes during the war. Mass killings was just one of many. Did the citizens of Germany actually support this, or were they just not aware? Winning the war does not determine that it will change people's ideology and beliefs. And the criminals had to be punished for their war crimes. That was a big challenge for Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. They had to face the big question of how to deal with active members of the Nazi Party after all the cruelties they were involved in. The leader of the Nazis, Hitler, had shot himself when he knew that the war was coming to an end, and he knew what was coming for him. Similarly, out of fear of what would happen, a lot of Nazi members went away to Argentina, Spain, and Vatican City. For the Allies, more than punishing the criminals, the objective was to eliminate the whole ideology, because winning the war does not determine that it will change people's ideology and beliefs. We all know that the biggest contributor to influence is media, which is what the Allies sought to control and destroy. Over 30,000 diff books were banned from everywhere, and not just banned, but some were collected and destroyed. The people of Germany who let this atrocity take place were made the ones to blame. The population was made responsible for everything the Nazis did, and they were made aware of all the cruelty that was carried out by the Nazis. Basically, the idea was to create psychological warfare among the citizens by making them feel guilty and responsible. They made it like it was every single German's fault for what all that happened during the war and the crimes committed by the Nazis, because they let it happen, and the Nazis weren't the only ones to blame. Posters were put up with pictures of the concentration camps, with big text which read, "You are guilty of this." The citizens were even made to help out in burying the dead bodies of the victims of the concentration camps, in hopes that it would make them understand the pain and suffering they have caused by letting the Nazis carry on with their crimes. Films and movies were made and shown to Germans, as of course, media is the easiest way to influence people. The point was to make the Germans aware and informed about the atrocities that were carried on, and to make them feel guilty in a way for letting it happen. One of the harsh parts was that the Germans were frequently and randomly beaten out and assaulted in the public, and it became a common thing that the Germans didn't feel safe going out in the evening. But all of this was said to be carried out to make sure they changed the mindset of the German population who brought the Nazi ideology. Their only goal was to make the Germans feel responsible for all the crimes of the Nazis. This was the beginning of the denazification of Germany. The interesting part is that the term denazification was actually coined in 1943, long before the war ended. The Allies' only goal was to remove the idea of nationalism and socialism, which was heavily popular in Germany. They wanted to remove the ideology before the war even ended, because they knew winning wouldn't mean much if the people still had the same mindset. It would just allow another party with similar ideologies to come into power. The objectives of this process were put in text during July of 1945, and many of the Nazi members were reviewed and sanctioned around April of 1948. According to Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin denazification was not just a small task to carry on, but a strategic warfare. The main focus of United States President Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill was to remove the Nazi military influence on the public. In August of 1945, the Western Allies had made a list of 178,000 Nazis to put under arrest, while the Soviets had already proceeded to the internment of 67,000 Reich officials. This was not a small number to achieve. To reach that number, the Allies had to clearly state what their goals were with the denazification process and the consequences for the Nazis, to let them know what would happen if they did not obey. A United States memo from July 1945 for the denazification explains their objectives as arrest of Nazi leaders and any other persons dangerous to the Allied occupation, exclusion of members of the Nazi Party who had been more than nominal participants from both public office and positions of responsibility and private enterprises, eradication of Nazi laws, dissolution of the Nazi Party and all its affiliated organizations, and also to ensure that it would not be revived. Removal of symbols, flags, and anthems relating to the Nazis. Complete removal of Nazi ideology from German Information Services schooling system. Setting the goals and plans for the denazification process was the easiest part. The execution would be the hardest. The citizens were made to fill up a form in which they had to clearly mention their education, training, and employment in the military. They were made to show their income sources and assets for clear transparency. Most importantly, show their membership in the National Socialist Party. These forms would be evaluated by someone from the denazification program, United States Intelligence, and the special branch of the military. They would verify these files with existing police files and documents. The point of this wasn't to find out the truth about the citizens or to identify Nazis, but to find out if a person was more than just involved with the Nazis, which is why the military also clearly stated they would safeguard the members who were forced to join the Nazis to save their lives, and the military would make sure they don't get sanctioned. The clear point of this was to find out who was forced to join the Nazis and who was on higher levels in the party and responsible for the crimes. Based on the information, the people were divided into three groups. Major offenders, who were sentenced to life imprisonment offenders, which included people in the military or in the party who profited off of the war, who were sentenced up to 10 years in prison. Lesser offenders, who were sentenced up to 3 years in prison. Everyone who was into these three groups was more than just a member in the Nazi party and had a role in all the cruelty. Well, that was just the plan. The real problem came up when they started implementing it. Denazification execution. The plan was the easier part, but bringing this plan into life and changing the mindset of the citizens and prior Nazis was not going to be an easy task. Totally. There were over 12 million Nazis. The United States detained over 400,000 members for inquiry, and the U.S. realized that it was not an easy task to sort out hundreds of thousands and millions of Nazis into groups based on their involvement, despite making them fill out a questionnaire with over 100 questions. All of the Nazis were extremely trained and had great political backgrounds. The Nazis were behaving extremely nice and pleasant, which made it hard to figure out their identity, personality, and ideology. They were trained for this moment as well, which made it hard for the U.S. military officers to figure out which one of them should be put in which group. Germans, who were not official members of the party, were either smart enough to not fall for the Nazi ideology, despite everything, and rest had applied, but had gotten rejected. The whole process was extremely heavy and required a ton of trained manpower to thoroughly go through millions and millions of answers and come to conclusions to make serious decisions. This was too much for the Allies to handle at that point of time, as there was a huge lack of trained manpower. Germans were not willing to take part in this, as they didn't want to turn on their own citizens. After a lot of setbacks and distractions faced by the United States and the Allies in the process of denazification, their focus became to rebuild the economy of Germany rather than making sure everyone paid for their crimes. The denazification in the Soviet area was not as good as it should have been. But what the Soviets did was that they gave the responsibility of denazification to the Germans themselves and created local anti-Nazi parties to ensure the whole ideology was removed. There were millions of Nazis who had to go through the denazification process, and it was getting tedious for the Allies. Only the people in the major offenders group were sanctioned seriously, and others were let go with a slap on the wrist, like community service or having to pay a fine. Many who were guilty of serious crimes and racist behavior were let go with a fine of a few hundred marks or 1,000. Fun fact, 2/3 of German diplomats were actually former Nazis. During the end of 1945, the Allies decided to carry on the denazification process independently, which was good, but brought a lot of contradicting measures. The United States followed the method of having a questionnaire, which the Britain and French were following as well, but the Soviets didn't even touch it. They delegated the task to local parties to carry on with the denazification. One of the many main objectives of the United States was to get talented scientists relocated to the U.S. Data shows that over 80% of them were former Nazi members. As a conclusion, weapon manufacturing was banned in Germany. Now, to answer the question of how Germany was denazified, it isn't. After the death of Hitler, many major Nazi leaders fled to different countries, and others just went on with their work as if nothing had happened. Of course, some were punished for their crimes, but not most of them. The whole idea of Nazism just got diluted and became an idea of communism or socialism in a way. The Nazi officers just took off their uniforms and went on with their lives. A few months ago, Trudeau and Zelensky gave a Ukrainian Nazi war veteran standing ovation in Canadian Parliament. Were all of the Nazis held responsible and punished? No. But because of all the efforts from the past few decades, the Nazi ideology has diminished, and people are more aware.